show. We'd like to thank Carol and Josh and the Skyscraper Museum for hosting us. And I hope that if you haven't already, after our little song and dance here, that you explore the museum here, because it really is incredible. And this wall over here of New York skyscrapers will have hopefully a little bit more meaning after some of our readings tonight.
And I think the AC will be turned back on.
Yes.
Right? It's a win-win. Also, we just wanted, to say thank you very much for coming, and thank you to anybody who has listened. Carol mentioned, I think she oversold us a little bit, because I'm sure that there are people here who have never heard us before, and maybe people who have never heard a podcast. So just a curious show of hands if you have heard the show before, just to get an idea. All right, hi. Okay. Good. They know who we are, Greg.
Well, a little bit of our origin story before we get to why we're here. Tom and I started this podcast in the summer of 2007. We named ourselves the Bowery Boys, actually after the 19th century street gang that prowled the Bowery. This was in 2007. We were all into gangs of New York back then. That was when you talked about New York City history. It was always from like gang activity, gang life, because the movie had just come out.
And also because we recorded our first show in my apartment, which was at Essex and Canal in the Lower East Side. So I was in that apartment from 1997 until last year. So we recorded most of the shows in my guest room. And so one day in the summer of 2007, Greg came over and he had just bought a new Macintosh, a new laptop, the old white plastic ones, if you remember those.
Producing podcasts back then were, like Hillary Clinton has a podcast now. It's like, it's weird to think that presidential candidates have podcasts when we were like, it was like, what do they call it, like spit and string, right? We just used sort of like created it from like...
Well, we didn't really know what podcasts were necessarily, but he had just picked up a new laptop and it had GarageBand, the program, on it. And one of the things that it said was you could make music, you could make like, I don't know, make your own dance music, or you could record a podcast. And so I literally bought Podcasting for Dummies, and we recorded our first show, which was terrible. Episode number 1 on the history.
Thank you for listening to all of them. Hopefully, maybe your ears have been spared that first one. I don't remember.
But that was on the history of Canal Street, because Canal Street was right outside the window. And we did very limited research on that show, and it is no longer available.
So we might unveil that for humor's sake. But anyway,
But tomorrow? Can we say what we're doing tomorrow?
Yeah, so over the course of over 9 years, we've gone all over New York City from the Lenape Indians and recently to the show I did last week, which was probably one of the most sort of modern set ones, which was New York City's relationship with the video game and sort of arcades and that type of thing. So we go all over the place. So, we've done like Boss Tweed, we've done the Chrysler Building, we've done the history of the Civil War draft riots, all over the place.
Zoning law, 1916 and 1961.
And this week's show on Friday, I think might interest some of you in here, is the sort of scandalous tale of Madame Restel, who was the Gilded Age, a notorious woman, but her story is very detailed and sophisticated. She was an abortionist in the mid-19th century in a period where people had quite different feelings about women's health back then than they do today. So that's the show we're going to tackle now. So
she was referred to as the she-devil frequently, and she was really, really spectacularly famous, infamous. Notorious. So that's the thing that we are going to be staying up late tonight researching and recording tomorrow morning. It'll be out on Friday.
So essentially, we've done all of these podcasts, so we were like, how can we make this an experience that you can take not just from listening, but as something that like you can sit in your armchair at home and visit these places. But is also a resource that if you're walking through the city and you want a guidebook, but you want something that's a little bit more history focused. So that was the concept of our book, which we just released on Ulysses Press, called Adventures in Old New York. It is, we call it a historical guidebook. You can never leave your, I mean, ideally, this is a book for someone who hasn't yet come to New York City. This is for someone who lives in another place, and they're like, wow, I want to revisit, I want to come to New York the present, but I also want to visit it in the past. So,
and we should, I'm going to interrupt you. We should also mention that half of our listeners do not live in New York. And a lot of people actually don't even live in the United States. We have a lot of listeners who are just, New York is a city that has super fans all over the world. And so we have a lot of people listening who just really live and breathe New York, everything.
I mean, New York City is, to a lot of people, is sort of like Disneyland. I mean, they don't, we living here maybe see that as
that respect.
But, so anyway, what we decided for this book is to focus on old New York, meaning New York City as it was kind of defined before 1898,
and
the consolidation of New York, which created the 5 boroughs. Yeah. Now, we would love to do the very same treatment to the other 5 boroughs. We'd still be working on that book right now if we had passed that wide of a net. So we narrowed it specifically to Manhattan.
So we broke it into 25 chapters, starting at the southern tip and going to the northern tip, each one taking or tackling one neighborhood, and each one starting off with a main story, a main article that's. Most of them are based on podcasts, I think.
Yeah, pretty much every single one of the sort of main stories is based on something that we already recorded. So.
And then there are 20 places that you can visit in each neighborhood that are historically significant, either major history sites or places that we think are often overlooked, or places that have vanished. So,
and then these little maps at the front, which are mostly accurate, that are right here, that you could actually go out. I mean, this one's actually extraordinary, and it's amazing to be here near Battery Park. There's a whole chapter on Battery Park because there's so much history obviously contained in this little section here, because that's where it kind of all began. Right. In terms of New York as a settled colony. So
what we're doing tonight, is we're going to read 2 of those opening mini articles, and then do 4 of the small places to visit.
And
right?
So, and so since we're here at the Skyscraper Museum, we thought we would actually focus on some of the skyscraper treasures that we have in the book. So we're actually, for the first one, going to go out of this neighborhood because this is actually one of my favorite buildings in New York. People are like, why? The name of the chapter is called Poor Little One-Time Square, Crossroads of the World. Excuse me, goggles.
Can you hear us, by the way, in the back? It's okay.
I mean, no one has ever accused us of being quiet, but if we need to project more, we'll happily do that. Almost nobody knows what the building at the crossroads of the world really looks like. Few can describe the original appearance of the building that features centrally in the city's biggest party of the year. Its name is never included in New York's top 10 most visited structures, despite its prominent placement in millions of photographs snapped by tourists. And despite sitting at one of the busiest intersections in the world, almost no one works inside the thing.
Such is the curious fate of One-Time Square, the humble, disfigured building at the center of modern New York City. Oh.
Yeah. Oh, Tom doesn't even see these. I have a funny picture of him and a rabbit. No, I don't.
At the dawn of the 20th century, the thrust of New York's growth had already ventured past 42nd Street, and splendid new mansions stretched up Fifth Avenue to St. Patrick's Cathedral at 50th Street and beyond. Longacre Square to its west served up carriage, saddle, and harness shops, which was convenient given its proximity to the American Horse Exchange on 50th and Broadway.
But a new force was steadily high-kicking its way up Broadway, the musical theater district, which by the turn of the century was situated primarily along Broadway between Herald Square and Longacre Square. The first theater jumped the 42nd Street frontier in 1895, ensuring the district's theatrical legacy up to its day. It is Grand Central to the east of 42nd Street, however, that's to thank for bringing the city's newest subway system to Longacre Square. Because of the valuable properties lining Broadway between Union Square and Herald Square, that would be the ladies' mile shops and all the luxury hotels around there, landowners objected to messy subway tunnels being dug up under their street. So instead, the first subway line was pushed east of here, up 4th Avenue, today's Park Avenue, to Grand Central on 42nd Street. It would then cut west to Broadway at Longacre Square before continuing uptown under Broadway. This decision would essentially define 42nd Street as one of New York's most important roads.
All this excitement would pique the curiosity of young Adolph Ochs, who in 1896 had become the new publisher of the New York Times. While their offices were down on Park Row with many of the city's other daily papers along Newspaper Row, which faced City Hall, publications were getting larger, outgrowing their offices and printing facilities, and readers were steadily moving uptown. The New York Herald had moved offices to 34th and Broadway in 1894, a gamble that turned out to be so successful the plaza would eventually be named for it. Certainly, the same could be done for the Times at the next major intersection of Broadway. There was only one problem. Another building already occupied the triangular plot of land at 42nd and Broadway. In fact, it had just been built in 1899, the Paps Building, a 9-story modern steel skyscraper. But that's not an issue if you got the money. Get rid of it. And so the Paps Building goes down in history as the first skyscraper ever dismantled, in this case, by the George A. Fuller Company.
That's
that true?
Best known for the Flatiron Building. The architect, Cyrus L.W. Idlitz, no stranger to Beaux-Arts frillery, leaned heavily on the Italian Renaissance in his design for the new Times building, creating the impression that one was standing next to a Venetian palazzo, except of course that his building was much taller and more out of proportion than anything that you'd find in Venice. And at its feet lay the new 42nd Street subway station. Upon its completion in 1904, the 25-story building became the second tallest building in the world after Joseph Pulitzer's New York World Building downtown. Both the new office building and the newly named plaza in front of it, Times Square, were feted by a massive fireworks celebration at midnight on December 31st, 1904. The building's narrow silhouette overlooking such a large open plaza made it a natural and picturesque spot for such a party. However, the ash that dropped from the fireworks upon the 200,000 people crammed into the square was less pleasant, and the city officials banned the fiery practice 2 years later. Looking for a new and less dangerous way to signal the stroke of midnight, Ochs turned to the ball drop, an old English maritime timekeeping tradition developed to help ships accurately set their navigational chronometers. The newspaper hired Strauss Signs to use electricity to light 125-watt bulbs on a giant electric bulb, which during the last minute of 1907 fell in accordance with the prearranged plan, the newspaper noted, on January 1st, 1908.
By then, Times Square had become the hottest destination in town, brimming with champagne and lobster palaces, Ziegfeld showgirls, and that most glamorous and clever invention, the electronic sign. Ochs's newspaper quickly outgrew its wedge-shaped headquarters, and in 1913 moved to nearby offices at 229 West 43rd Street. But they still owned the old triangular building, and in 1928 slapped something on there that would change the look of Times Square forever. An electronic news zipper, or as they called it, a motogram. A 5-foot-tall message board that used more than 14,000 light bulbs to create a ribbon of information scrolling across the front of the building, illuminating the day's headlines. The fate of one Times Square had been sealed. It would not only wear an electronic sash from here on out, but it would soon be completely covered by electronic knickknacks. The motogram announced the results of the 1928 election, Hoover won. Although probably its most well-known bit of breaking news was many years later when it triumphantly announced the surrender of Japan, ending World War II. Other elaborate advertisements soon clung to its surface and have included everything from stock quotes to steamy Nissan Cup noodles advertisements affixed in 1996. In 1961, the Times sold the building to Allied Chemical, which promptly replaced its splendid Beaux-Arts facade with futuristic white marble.
Yeah.
But hey, who could even see it?
Here you go. No more beauty. It is a truly weird concept if you stop to think about it. Every year, millions of people gaze at One Times Square on their televisions during the annual New Year's Eve celebrations, momentarily breaking their gaze from TV host Ryan Seacrest to focus on a shimmering ball that in some form has lowered nearly every year since 1907. The building has become so synonymous with celebrations and electronic razzle-dazzle that the structure supporting the party is literally superficial. There are no tenants in the upper floors, and its windows are completely blocked today by giant LED billboards. To say history has been stripped from One Times Square is an understatement. The years have turned this glorious building, responsible for the very name of Times Square, into the architectural equivalent of a mannequin, sporting the latest in electronic fashions and the most famous headgear in town.
Times Square, well, we have a few, right?
Two.
Yeah.
In fact, this chapter was based on an old solo show we did on the building, because this building has fascinated me so for years. And then we just did one last Christmas on the New Year's Eve party.
Right, the history of New York at New Year's.
Which luckily features more Guy Lombardo than Ryan Seacrest. For our next, we are going chronologically, but we are coming back downtown, a little closer to here. So our next destination is around City Hall, but no, we're not going to talk about City Hall. The name of this chapter is the Park Row Building and the Woolworth Building.
And if you happen to be reading along, it's on page 70.
Please turn to your hymnals. You shall now pass the plate.
The wine comes later. For several decades in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, it seemed that the city's highest, or at least tallest, achievements loomed around New York's relatively delicate City Hall. Completed in 1812, the white lacy administrative home of the mayor was designed by Joseph Francois Mangin and John McComb Jr. and is the oldest operating city hall in the United States today. Yet its loveliness is literally overshadowed by that which towers over and around it, some of it among the city's most beautiful architecture. The Brooklyn Bridge, completed in 1883, more than 70 years after City Hall, was designed by John Augustus Roebling as a Gothic urban monument, almost rugged in comparison with New York's other bridges. Meanwhile, buried beneath City Hall is one of the most spectacular stations in the city subway system. Its grand arch is lined with Guastavino tiling. While the station shuttered in 1945, it is occasionally open for tours. That's parenthetical.
But equal to these marvels is the array of skyscrapers which stand at the perimeter of the park, gazing down at the triangle of trees. While none of these buildings can still claim to be the tallest in the world, although 3 held this title at various times in the 20th century, they all still dazzle. 2 of the tallest skyscrapers are still around today. One of them, the Woolworth Building, is an icon of grace and style. The other, the Park Row Building, well, we're happy it's still around. Up until 1890, the tallest building in New York was just down the street, Trinity Church. The notion of building other structures any closer to the heavens would remain an engineering impossibility, not to mention a sacrilege, until the substantial development of 2 key building features: steel frame construction to support the weight and improve the economics of the taller building, and of course the elevator to shuttle people up and down the tall structures.
With the introduction of both of these inventions in the mid to late 19th century, tall buildings soon began shooting up here, in Chicago, New York's chief rival for the skies in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, and in other major cities around the country. The word skyscraper would soon be coined to describe these unique rectangular towers. Skyscrapers first sprouted in the City Hall area along the narrow little street to its east, Park Row. By the 1840s, this street was already home to New York's most important newspapers, and the open plaza at the street's northern end became known as Printing House Row. With the rise of sensational, page-turning, scandalicious yellow journalism in the late 1800s, newspapers became fabulously lucrative businesses, and their publishers extremely wealthy.
In 1890, Joseph Pulitzer built a new headquarters for his New York World at 99 Park Row, the building nearest the entrance to the Brooklyn Bridge, which had just opened 7 years before. It was located so near the Brooklyn Bridge, in fact, that the building would be torn down in 1955 to accommodate a new bridge on-ramp. The world's height, 308 feet tall, 40 feet taller if you counted that antenna, was chosen despite his rivals at the New York Times, which had just constructed their new headquarters a block away at 41 Park Row. Pulitzer even employed George Post, the same architect that the New York Times had hired, for his newspaper palace, but not before bribing him with a $10,000 bonus to make his world building taller. The architect later said of the challenge, quote, "It would be an interesting problem to construct two buildings inside of each other for rival papers and to make the buildings as different as the politics of the papers," unquote. Naturally, the amoral idea of a commercial building reaching closer to the heavens than a house of worship left many New Yorkers appalled. Any momentary spiritual outcry, however, was quickly muffled as an all-out skyscraper race consumed the attention and resources of major American cities for decades to come.
In 1899, another building on Park Row grabbed the tallest building trophy. The Park Row building, still standing today at 15 Park Row, came in at 391 feet, thanks in part to two striking cupolas, clad in copper and reminiscent of a Portuguese cathedral. Unlike many of the showier skyscrapers of the day, the Park Row building was funded and built by a syndicate of businessmen, including August Belmont Jr., the future benefactor of the New York subway system and chairman of the Interborough Rapid Transit Company, the IRT. With its matching cupolas, however, the skyscraper was considered downtown's original twin towers. But while the building was indeed filled with hundreds of offices, the cupolas were actually home to apartments, including that of the city's most powerful political figure, Tammany Hall's boss Croker.
The Park Row building has managed to survive despite some nasty critiques when it opened. One critic bellowed, "New York is the only city in which such a monster would be allowed to rear itself." Another nickname logged it as the Horned Monster, two horns, not the sort of reaction that usually greets a classic. The Park Row building's importance fizzles when compared with the gem that would rise just a few hundred feet from its front door less than 15 years later. While Midtown Manhattan soon attracted the city's new crop of skyscrapers, one final grand gesture awaited the city surrounding City Hall. It would take 3 years to complete, but by its opening in April of 1913, the Woolworth Building at 792 feet would become an icon of American capitalism and a symbol of the power and wealth of New York real estate. Its technical achievements, impossible to imagine a decade prior, only reinforced the themes of the day. Money could indeed defy gravity.
Designed by Cass Gilbert for the five and dime retail king, Frank Woolworth, the Woolworth Building was a glowing candle of a skyscraper next to dainty little City Hall. The Woolworth's intricate facade was adorned with many of the international races echoed down at Gilbert's other big Manhattan building, the U.S. Customs House, 1 Bowling Green. Built 3 years before the city enacted stricter zoning laws, which, among other things, forced the construction of setbacks that would result in tiered wedding cake-shaped structures, the Woolworth simply zoomed straight up into the sky. Advertisements to fill the office space in the Woolworth Building made use of its unique place in American commerce. Said one ad, "Customers will never overlook your store. If it is in the Woolworth Building, the sight and thought of the world's greatest structure will remind them of you and your store."
The Woolworth Building is in both every tome on great urban architecture and every tourist guidebook to New York. The Park Row, meanwhile, is almost always overlooked. It's like a burnished spinster compared with the Woolworth, but both, it should be remembered, held the same glorious title for a time. We'll take an apartment in the Park Row cupola over a Woolworth any day. Who are we kidding? Why did we even write that? I totally picked the Park Row. Scratch out that last sentence. So anyway, that's our tale of those two structures, which when you guys are done here, stroll up to City Hall and you can still observe them in their glory.
Which gets us very excited about your upcoming show, by the way.
So we are going to end this and thank everyone in the back for standing and for your patience. We have 4 small little things we're going to read that are points of interest that you can also visit. And in fact, they're sort of written like, like things that would be in a tourist guide. But we want to give you a little bit of a sampling of these, starting with a building that's actually not there. Sorry, but
this is a vanished.
This is a vanished building. It's
on the wall over here, though, right?
Oh yeah. This is the Singer. This is the Singer Building.
A building in stitches. Thank you.
We have like 6 puns in this, so please bear with us.
Yeah, those first 2, there were no puns. I'm kind of disappointed.
Well, this one makes up for it. For a few short months from 1908 to 1909, the building that stood here, so we'll tell you where this is in a second, was the tallest in the world, the 47-story Singer Building, the skyscraper trophy built by the head of the Singer Sewing Machine Company. Its unusual appearance, a narrow red tower shooting up from a chunky base, was among the most glorious on the young New York skyline. Its interior was festooned with bronze medallions engraved with the images of needle, thread, and bobbin. Because we can't have nice things, they ripped it apart at the seams and tore it down in 1967. Prior to 2001, it remained the tallest building in the world ever demolished.
Its replacement, the steel monolith One Liberty Plaza, was constructed unsurprisingly for U.S. Steel and was completed in 1973, the same year as the opening of the World Trade Center.
So this is Zuccotti Park. Many of you may know where that is. This was just to the north.
165 Broadway. All right. Moving on, we're going to Shadows of the Past. Pine and Nassau Streets. Ah, yes. The Equitable Building, 120 Broadway, is a whole lot of skyscraper for such a little place. Its striking, robust form befits its original tenant, the Equitable Life Insurance Society. But many considered it a harbinger of gloom and doom when it was completed in 1915 in the Wild West days of skyscraper construction. As buildings grew taller, residents soon complained that the superstructures cast enormous, dreary shadows along the streets of Lower Manhattan. Due to the controversies surrounding buildings like the Equitable and the Woolworth Building, New York's crucial zoning law of 1916 dictated that buildings be constructed with setbacks in the wedding cake style, as they called it, to help contain shadows and to allow for more sun to reach the sidewalks.
Compare the Equitable Building with 28 Liberty Street, formerly One Chase Manhattan Plaza. So if you go over there and you go to sort of just to the east of it, there's a large open plaza and it has that one weird white tree sculpture. It kind of looks like a big blob. That's called the Group of Four Trees. We'll compare those two because the modern plaza exemplifies the second great zoning change in New York, which was passed in 1961, which made it easier for skyscrapers to ascend straight up without setbacks while open public spaces were constructed on their base.
And we have, an entire show that we did maybe 10 shows ago about, so perhaps around episode 200, about these two zoning laws, 1916 and 1961, and about how they really shaped the city that we walk around in every day.
Now, I don't know if you noticed that in a couple of these pictures, there's like a weird building. You're like, what the heck is this? This is the world's worst post office. This was the prevailing opinion regarding the poorly designed, awkwardly dolled up building that once occupied the southern tip of today's City Hall Park. A 5-story post office and courthouse built in 1869. The flagrant nature of this structure was notable even in those good old corrupt days of outlandish and wildly expensive building construction.
Charmingly nicknamed Mullet's Monstrosity, after its architect, Alfred B. Mullet, the post office looked even sadder with the arrival of the beautiful Woolworth Building across the street in 1913. The, quote, unsightly and unsanitary old structure was finally stamped return to sender and torn down in 1939.
Now here's the thing though, is like, if this building somehow managed to survive, it would be one of New York's most, I think, most popular buildings, right? I mean, it's a lot of building. It's like a lot of design. but
tastes change.
But that just shows how tastes change. I mean, something to consider today with modern architecture, how like something that was beautiful 30 years ago might be an eyesore and tore down, but just imagine if we still have this today. So
it was at the southern tip, for those of you who don't know, southern tip of City Hall Park.
And finally,
it's kind of weird to even think that it could fit into that space.
Yeah. So finally, we're not going to talk about a building. We're going to talk. Well, it's a building, but it's a pier actually, and it's the one that's sort of right outside the window here. And we want to just give it a little shout out because this place is incredibly unique. The pier with no piers, literally. Manhattan's shoreline was, for much of its history, crowded with piers of various lengths and structural integrities. The western side of the island had the largest, most elaborate piers to serve enormous steamships and shipping vessels, large sheds that could accommodate thousands of people and tons of freight. Pier A, originally built for use by the Docks Department, is the last surviving example of this grand tradition, and it is a striking one.
It was built between 1884 and 1886 with the Statue of Liberty in mind. Not only are there clear views of Lady Liberty from here, but its tower roof is painted green to emulate her oxidized body. But it's the bling on top. Where's the bling? An elegant 1919 clock that's the most eye-catching. It was installed as a World War I memorial, the first such commemoration here or anywhere in the United States. And to visit that, well, you just have to cross the street.
And I think, most people may remember this being completely kind of like an unused building for years and years, and just recently it's opened up to have this sort of elaborate event space / delicious but slightly overpriced seafood / right?
Editorializing.
Hey, it's worth it. So
that's a little taste of what's in the book.
That's a little sampling of the book. Thank you, and we appreciate you guys. Hopefully, we'll get to meet many of you afterwards. We're going to sign a few books, but before we get to that, we would love to hear some questions about anything.
Any questions about
the podcast,
how the podcast works or how we've been doing it?
Yeah.
That would be fun.
Thank you so much for so many people you've inspired with New York City history. I think it's a toss-up between you guys and maybe Lin-Manuel Miranda.
We're easier to get tickets to.
A little more than a year ago, there was an absolutely spectacular exhibit here at the Skyscraper Museum that went into the economics and the engineering of new modern skyscrapers. 57th Street comes to mind.
Oh yeah.
But there's much more. How do you guys deal with that generally when you have, in effect, history in the making? I mean, we've had the great romantic romanization of skyscrapers as we know them from the past,
Yeah.
but that'll undoubtedly continue. How do you factor that into your podcast?
Well, I mean, it's funny because, I mean, obviously when we started the show, we were we were so disconnected from the politics of the things we were talking about. And over the years, we've sort of been surrounded and consumed by it. So now I feel like every subject that we do, we're like, what's the sort of the modern connection to this? And you know, when we talk about a subject like Robert Moses or Jane Jacobs, this comes up a lot because, you know, our listeners have like a wide range of different feelings, and all of it manifests to this day, right? And there's not really a right answer or a wrong answer to all of those. So to be able to juggle it, I mean, luckily because there's two of us, we sometimes get to actually take opposing sides on occasion.
Yeah, we did. Episode 100 was on Robert Moses, and then episode 200 that we did 6 months ago, 5 months ago, was on Jane Jacobs. And so I think in the 5 or so years in between the recording of those two episodes, we became a little bit more, or we took on a more nuanced view. I mean, we literally would like use funny voices when we talk about Robert Moses, you know, and that has largely subsided because I think it's more complicated, you know, than just using a funny voice.
But but back to like the 57th Street. I mean, I can like personally say, I loathe those like super tall towers, but also know that because I've studied New York City history, that everything always changes in this. That's what this city is. And we don't live in a museum piece. And so in order to survive, it does have to change. And so what you sort of have to monitor as a New Yorker and as someone who like loves history is, are things going too far? Are they not going too far? You know, I mean, it's always a challenge.
Yeah.
Actually.
Having said that, I think that our sort of most our comfort zone is probably the Gilded Age era, and so a lot of the episodes take place in that time period, or late second half of the 19th century. When we get, and most episodes then do kind of come up to today, and so we have to address what happened and what's the rest of the story. But I feel like sometimes it's more comfortable to stay that far.
Well, because you have to deal with like actual history versus the nostalgia for that history. You know, people are like, oh, I wish Times Square of the 70s was back again. I love it, you know. But it's like, well, what part of that is like a fabrication of nostalgia? And you know, but then other times, this video game show I just did, like a lot of people wrote into me and said, oh yeah, I used to go to those video arcades in the 1980s, and some parts of Times Square were bad, but some of them weren't. I mean, it's always a much more nuanced story than I think that even we can tell.
And we grew up, I mean, we moved to the city in the same year, just by chance, 1993. So we remember getting drinks together at the Howard Johnson's at Times Square and quite liking that scene. You know, that was a really fun scene. And it seems so far removed from anything that is there today. So I'm nostalgic for that video.
Obviously, you guys are passionate and love New York so much. Could you ever imagine living anywhere else, or even doing a podcast about any other city?
Well, as a matter of fact, yeah, I lived for a year and a half in Paris, and I actually may have fallen in love with Paris before I fell in love with New York. I hate to say, in some ways, falling in love with city planning and the city history behind it, and Haussmann, and just all the initiatives the city took that have resulted in that city's aesthetic, which is kind of amazing. And I also lived in Berlin for 2001, and that is another incredible place doing its own incredible thing. So yeah, and we have. What do you want to say?
Well, so you know, I think
I don't want to say too much.
Yeah. Well, so there's yes. We have thought about like taking the show on the road a little bit, but like just being very, very subtle about it. And on top of that, there's going to be in November our official first spin-off show. So. That's all I'm gonna say.
You just gave yourself chills.
I know, I just did. But nothing. But it's going to take a. It's going to take. All I'm going to say is it's the kind of show that's going to take a step back. It's my mysterious.
The other thing to add here is that we both had other jobs. And I continue to still have another job during most days. Greg quit his job 2 weeks ago. 3 weeks?
2 months ago.
Correction, 2 months ago. I just
pulled all of my hair out. It was bald for like 3 weeks. I don't know what you're talking about. No, we now get to have more time to properly do this. I mean, if there were any restrictions up to this point, it was really just what life throws at you. So we're trying to do more as we approach 2017.
Yes, in the back.
Have you written about or done an episode on New Amsterdam, old New York?
So we haven't actually done a show New Amsterdam proper, like one called New Amsterdam from the beginning to the end. But we have an old show about Peter Stuyvesant, and we have several shows that go through New Amsterdam to get to another point. For instance, we have a show on the history of the New York City Fire Department, and so the first quarter of the whole show is set in New Amsterdam, because boy, did they handle fires in a funny way. They had you had to have buckets of water every night at the street corner, and they had the night's rattle watch and everything.
And we just did a show on the Lenape, so that dealt much of that story obviously involves New
But
Amsterdam.
believe you me, we'll keep going back to that world because it's really fascinating, and you kind of realize the more you study New Amsterdam, the more you study something that happened so long ago, you realize how much of it's still here. Those buildings aren't here, but the names are still here, our streets are the same, especially down here, So to me, it's still a very relevant story to talk about.
Oh yeah, great. Island at the Center of the World.
Oh, that's the best book. Yeah, I wasn't sure though. I love that book. It's some of the most wonderful research.
What's your favorite topic or show?
What's your favorite? It's kind of hard. We did one, I like the history of theater, and we did one on the birth of the modern American musical, The Showboat, that I really got into. Anytime I can go through the archives at the Museum of Performing Arts at Lincoln Center, I have a good time with that. What's your favorite?
Well, this is a little bit of a cop-out, because occasionally we'll do these mini-series, which is a series of 3 or 4 shows of related subjects. In fact, we have another one planned for just a couple months from now. I really like our series on New York in the Civil War, because New Yorkers don't realize that New York we were located in Union, but we weren't always on the side of the Union, or at least, many of our leaders and many of the residents.
Yeah.
So it makes a powerful story. So we did 3 parts, one on Fernando Wood, who was the scoundrel mayor of New York City during the period, talking about the Civil War draft riots, of course. And then this crazy thing that happened in 1864 when the Confederates were losing badly, so they had spies come into New York City and try to burn it down by setting fires throughout the city. It was unsuccessful, but a fascinating story nonetheless. So I think that might be my favorite.
How are we on time?
Maybe a couple more questions. I just wanted to cool off the place a little bit. I don't know if they can hear you or not.
How that sound?
After they sold it to Allied Chemical,
It's a rent. Oh yeah.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, it's the price is paid for the structure.
It's the most visible billboard probably in America, so they probably make a ton of money.
Yeah, no, they make a
Yeah,
fortune.
most
out of that.
expensive per square foot
Okay.
billboard space in the world.
The most expensive per
Square foot.
Oh my gosh.
He said the most expensive per square foot billboard space in the world. That does it.
2 quick questions.
Yeah.
One, can you speak to the ongoing conversion of historic structures, Woolworth Building, the Pump Building, into private luxury apartments and what that says about, the grandeur of old New York being co-occupied. Also, can you talk to the new building on Vanderbilt and the tearing down the building next to Grand Central and the juxtaposition of the new and modern? Oh, yeah.
You want to tackle that?
Well, I think of it this way. Actually, I'm going to use a different example. And that example is all of the amazing, beautiful banks that this city has from the early 20th century. Some of the most beautiful structures in New York are banks. Today, if you had a list of like the 20 most beautiful banks and you were to go to them today, 3/4 of them would be CVS pharmacies or would be drugstores, right? And so it's something you have to keep in mind. It's like, do I still want this building here? If I still want this building here, does it make sense for the city to still have this building here? Then it's got to be usable. So there aren't a lot of businesses that can fill a space like that. So I think of it the same way when I think of Woolworth Tower residences, or whatever they're calling it, which, we live in a changing city, and that was built in a period when downtown City Hall area was the hottest office area in the United States. And so they could fill all of that up with all sorts of businesses. But in this day and age where businesses are configured in a completely different fashion, and we also have a city that does have somewhat of a housing crisis, although that's like luxury housing. I certainly prefer, that to the defacement of the structures.
And same thing with hotels. This has happened obviously, with Plaza. We just did a show on the Waldorf Astoria. There's conversion happening there, and they have landmark the facade, but nothing inside, and it's probably the city's best example of Art Deco intact.
Oh yeah, the Hearst Tower. I think that's like. Yeah, I actually you see some really terrible examples of hybrids in the city that are sort of exploiting air rights and all sorts of different things. But again, we don't, we need New York to keep changing because that's what New York is. And if New York ever becomes a museum piece, then it sort of like, in a way, I think loses part of the reason why we're here. Do I wish that Google would move into the Woolworth Building? Yeah, but I didn't make that decision. It would be awesome to still have like, it in sort of its usual, its sort of purpose. And then,
I think we have time for one last.
This is, I guess, take two answers. If you time travel just to take a day in one's time in New York District, individual responses, please.
Time travel.
Well,
for
I would
one
need
day.
I have to properly inoculate. But my focus is, it's like, well, let's see where I'm going to go. My favorite era is Revolutionary War history. So clearly, as long as I was like not destroyed in a cannonball, I would probably head here to July 9th, 1776. When George Washington read the Declaration of Independence, and everyone got wild and crazy and went down and tore down the statue of the Royal Green. But just the idea of like, what would it be like to be in a physical space, which I'm very used to, but structures would be different, but the streets would be the same. Like I'd still be able to find my way to the waterfront, although actually half of that would be landfill also. I love that area.
Yeah, I think I would do something maybe even more fun, which would be going back about, 170 years, Great Blizzard. Hold on, only because P.T. Barnum was having a big circus at the Madison Square Garden on Madison Square, while the blizzard was taking place and the VIP of the city were there, they got trapped inside and it turned into complete free-for-all with booze flowing and people sort of just like taking over the circus and acting out because it couldn't go anywhere. I think it would have been really fun. You know, I like this city in a storm.
But just on the idea of nostalgia, I was just about to say, like Coney Island in 1904 or whatever. But I just went to the museum out in Coney Island on Friday and just see some of the artifacts, and it's a great little museum. But you're like, oh right, they didn't have air conditioning. Everyone was kind of wearing like all their clothes at the beach, and the rides were kind of dangerous, and people were being exploited. So it's like, you're like, okay, so we're putting this sort of like a gloss of hazy glamour all over these type of things. I mean, you know, I don't mean to be a Debbie Downer. Those are still kind of like fun to think about.
Yeah, let's leave this on an up note. Thank you all very much